Good evening. Tonight's topic is the childless couple. We're going to be limiting ourselves this evening to talking about the couple who is childless by choice, rather than the couple who cannot have children for medical reasons. Our guest is Ellen Peck. She's a syndicated newspaper columnist, a founder member of NON, that's the National Organization of Non-Parents, and the author of The Baby Trap, the bestseller which sets out to prove that childless marriages are happier. Awful lot of women must hate you, Ellen, after having read your book, because you sort of debunk the basic assumption that motherhood is uniquely fulfilling. How do you answer people who attack you on these grounds?
Well, actually, I'm not the one who tried to tear apart the myth. The studies and the statistics have been in psychological journals for a long time. The studies, that is, that show that child-free marriages are happier. And we are saying child-free marriages, not childless. There's a slight difference in connotation, and we want to emphasize the positive aspects of child-free lifestyles. And one of the basic functions of NON, the National Organization for Non-Parents, is to give to couples who have chosen to be child-free some guidance and some help in answering the questions that they will face from a society that is geared to expect everyone to have children.
What about the maternal instinct? As far as you're aware, is there such a thing?
No, I could quote and go into studies on that, but perhaps the simplest way to disprove the maternal instinct is just to ask, well, if there were truly an instinct to have children, would anyone be free from it? I obviously am. And the percentage of child-free couples, according to Census Bureau figures, has been increasing annually since 1966. The latest studies that we have from several California universities show that as many as 18 to 20% of young college adults intend to have no children. And you see, if maternity were an instinct, it couldn't be that easily disregarded. I think there are reflexes like eye blinking, and there are drives like sex. But if there were an innate drive to have children, then our attitudes toward childbearing wouldn't vary so widely from culture to culture and couldn't change as quickly as they are.
Well, of course, experimental psychologists have proved that there is an innate maternal instinct in animals.
In animals, yes, but you know, animals don't live in a society that has moved from the forests into the cities. Very little is natural about our way of life. You know, everything about an animal is natural, but the clothes we wear, the transportation we use, the energy we consume, none of this is natural. We did certainly have instincts some time ago, but another thing we might realize about the maternal instinct is that, did it refer to a desire to have children? And if so, why do some cultures not connect sexual union with reproduction? Or did it refer to the fact that a woman knew what to do in order to give birth to a child on her own and how to care for it afterwards? And today we have classes for these things. It's clearly a long way from an instinctive behavior.
But if certain cultures don't originally associate the reproductive drive with motherhood, I mean, they must pretty soon find out about it.
Not necessarily, because in primitive cultures, remember that the act of conception takes place 9 months before birth. A lot of other things happen in those 9 months. There's a full moon, you know, another tribe attacks. So childbirth could be connected with all sorts of things. And
well, be this as it may, you do nevertheless challenge the basic Judeo-Christian concept of family life. What are you offering in its place?
We are suggesting that we may have defined family too narrowly. We have defined it as nuclear family, traditional marriage, man, woman, and biological children. Let's face it, in our culture, this family pattern has not worked. Our divorce rate is phenomenal. It's moving from 1 in 3 marriages to 1 in 2. Many of those marriages that remain together are what counselors call high stability, low happiness marriages. We have 50,000 women each year who abandon their children. 250,000 instances each year of severe child abuse and child neglect. We have a family system that is breaking down. The National Organization for Non-Parents is very interested in the preservation of family life, but we feel we should ask, what makes a family? A family can be 2 people. Perhaps two people, husband and wife, who relate to each other in circumstances of total intimacy and total love and do not involve themselves very much with career or community.
Are you
or
saying
perhaps
this is
a family.
the unique prerogative of the childless couple?
I'm saying it's more usual, but before I leave the point about the family, I think the ideal that we are reaching for is a concept of a flexible family. In other words, my family includes many thousands of teenagers who write to me every month. I have a child-free friend whose family is 3 square blocks in an urban renewal area of Baltimore, and there is no one in that 3-block area who is not part of her family and her husband's. There is a larger family of community and society, and sometimes when couples have their own children, they forget about the larger community. Certainly, close relationships are not unique to child-free couples, they are only more common. And we might ask, you know, I said before that studies showed child-free marriages to be happier. One of these studies was done by Dr. Harold Feldman at Cornell. There have been others. But the question is why? Is it because children, per se, always are destructive to marriage, because diapers begin the divorce process? No, it's simply that by insisting or urging that everyone in our society have children, we have made it inevitable that some people will have children who aren't really suited for parenthood. Can you imagine if we had a society that urged everyone to be a doctor? Wouldn't we have a lot of unhappy physicians who weren't suited for their work? Parenthood is a specialized occupation too.
I'm interested in these studies which you mentioned. How can you do a study on happiness? I mean, how can you determine happiness, who's happy, who's not? How can you make any statistics?
There are certain correlates. Verbal communication, non-verbal communication, amount of time spent together, amount of topics talked about over the course of the week, number of spontaneous two-of-you excursions. There are several correlates that are quite consistent, frequency and duration of lovemaking, things such as this.
All right, before we get into this any more deeply, could you sort of, for the benefit of those who've not read your book, The Baby Trap, give a little outline as to its message?
Yes, I think I could do that. The Baby Trap meant to say, here are the reasons why Bill Peck and Ellen Peck have chosen not to have children. Perhaps they'll be of interest to some of you who haven't decided whether or not to have children. Perhaps they'll help those of you who have become parents to understand why not everyone wants to. And there is a message also implicit in the title of The Baby Trap. Babies are romanticized in our society, and so is motherhood. You think of the covers on the women's magazines. But parenthood is a long-term process, and it is a trap in the sense that something is a trap when you don't know it's a trap. In other words, you walk into it expecting something quite promising, and you get a confinement, a restriction instead. Parenthood will take 20 years of your life. There's no two ways around it. If you love babies and think of yourself as the mother of an infant or a young child, just ask yourself if you would also be happy to think of yourself as the mother of a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old or a teenager.
I'm curious, when did this all start in your life? Do you think the seeds, so to speak, of aversion to motherhood were sown in your childhood by your parents' attitudes towards you?
Oh, I don't think so. When I was interviewing for The Baby Trap, I interviewed child-free couples, and I could find no consistency in background. Some had come from large families, some were only children, some had traditional upbringing, some had very artistic parents. I grew up in a very small town, and my upbringing was Catholic. And I certainly, when I married, expected to have children. It was not anything we decided before marriage. I believe this is different today. You see, I got married more than 8 years ago. And it was an assumption then. Now it is something to be considered and discussed, along with many other aspects of marriage. What happened, though, Samantha, was that we did not want to have children right away. We wanted to do things by ourselves first, to have some time for the two of us, and travel and explore our interests be free individuals before we became nurturers of children. But in the years when we were delaying the decision, we watched friends of ours have children. We watched their marriages change. We realized that our relationship was quite complete as it was, that we were very happy as we were, that a child could add nothing to our marriage.
It's very fortunate and perhaps a little unique that you both feel equally, your husband and you, that this is right for you. But how did you explain this to people close to you, such as your mother, your in-laws and so on, who must have had the sort of usual leanings towards grandchildren?
Well, we did not have a problem with parents and in-laws, and my parents may not have always approved of what I did, but they always understood or accepted. And I think that this is a serious problem often, particularly with a couple where one partner is an only child and therefore the only hope of grandchildren. This has to be explained, and in fact the first chapter of The Baby Trap that was written was the chapter on what do you say. When I would be talking to other couples who had decided not to have children, you know, they would ask in conversation, oh, do you have children? I would say no, and we're not going to. And they would say, oh, we're not either. What do you say? And we would exchange ideas. But it has to be made clear to parents that we made no promises. We signed no contracts at age 5. We will someday give you grandchildren. And in-laws or prospective grandparents would do their own children a favor by not exerting pressures, not offering savings accounts, not asking, is there any news yet? Because the choice should be made by the couple themselves.
You must get it said to you quite a lot, well, how do you know? You're not in a position to evaluate the pros and cons. You have no children. You're taking the negative side on hearsay or from research, but you have never experienced the joy, the creativity, the reward, the fulfillment, and so on of having children. How do you respond to this?
Well, I would say to that I've enjoyed the joy and the fulfillment and the creativity and the sense of total fulfillment that comes from not having children. The tragedy is that often people who do have children find that they then miss out on these things. And besides it being a wrong choice for them, there is an innocent life involved, that of a child, that they might have been happier without and who could have been asked to be born into better circumstances. The answer to that is that fulfillment is not the same for all people. Those who say to me, I am so happy as a mother, to think that you're depriving yourself of this happiness is sad. I would say, well, it's wonderful that you're happy as a mother, but what's happiness for you may not be happiness for me. And I would, raise this question to the audience, and I'm sure there are some happy mothers watching, that it may be a disservice, considering the statistics about unhappy parenthood, to say to friends, particularly young couples, parenthood is wonderful and fulfilling. Say instead, parenthood has been wonderful and fulfilling for me, but not as a total generalization, because people are different.
Do you get accused of being hedonistic and selfish and using this as a cop-out and avoidance of responsibility and so on?
Well, responsibility comes in many different forms. I consider our involvement with citizens groups, consumer groups, environmental groups, and teenagers to be part of our commitment to the larger family of the community. It's just as much of a responsibility as taking care of a 2-year-old.
But don't you feel that couples with children can also have this commitment to the community?
Well, they can.
And if they organize their lives up to a point, they can still have the time to involve themselves in all these activities?
They can, but often they do not. The woman who has 100 carpools a year, 2 a week, may have less time to be concerned about what's going on in other areas of the country, or indeed even another part of town. I would hazard no guesses here, but it is possible that child-free couples have more time and personal resources to give to the larger problems of society, which in the end will build a better society for those who have had children. It's not that all child-free couples vacation constantly in Europe drinking champagne. This is an unfortunate stereotype, I think. Our vacations do tend to be different. We don't take campers necessarily to the nearest lake. We we do tend to travel more extensively. But this is not selfishness, or if anyone would call it selfishness, it is certainly a selfishness that harms no one. We are leaving more room and more resources for other people's children. And I would contrast this to the selfishness of a woman who would say, I don't care about the environment future generations will face or about overpopulation. I'm going to have my own babies and as many as I want. You see, this is a sort of selfishness that could deprive
But people
other
who
people's
have
children.
conscious stirrings about contributing to the population explosion or draining the Earth's resources and so on, they still have the option to adopt. What do you feel about adoption?
Yes, I'm very much in favor of adoption. That is an absolutely joyous way to build your family. And I think it is almost, Samantha, a true test of whether or not you truly love children and would be a good parent. Because if you love children, you can love a child that doesn't look like you.
Would you ever consider adopting?
No, we would not, and I'll tell you why. We certainly have a close involvement with young people, with many young people. If we were to adopt and give so much of our care and time and attention to just one child, we would lose our involvement with a wide range of young people. Our lifestyle would not adapt itself to constant care of a child. And we must sort of break away from the myth that children, whether biological children or adopted children, are necessary to fulfill a marriage, because they aren't. We are concerned about population. We also value our privacy and our leisure. And I think that it's important to realize that there are these two reasons. In us, you know, we happen to have both reasons for not wanting children. But some couples feel a sense of sacrifice. They would like to have children, but they feel that the next generation will have a better world if this generation takes it easy with reproduction. This should be understood and admired, and so should the couple who has the strength to say, and the courage and the self-knowledge to say, children are not for us. What Non is concerned about is the fact that non-parents must defend themselves. Our headquarters for Non is in Palo Alto, California, and California is a pioneer state in many ways. We think of it as having very advanced ideas. But even there, where our organization started, there is a great deal of discrimination, really, against non-parents. I think it's discrimination, for example, when you can always ask a child-free couple, why don't you have children? But does anyone ever ask parents, why did you have children?
Well, how do you deal with this discrimination, this pressure from society?
That is why we formed the organization.
But you personally, I mean, how do you react?
Well, I'm perfectly willing to answer the question, why don't you have children? What I think, because I have, my answer is very well thought out, and my husband and I discussed it for a long time. And in fact, one reason why, 2 years after I wrote The Baby Trap, one reason why I'm still explaining is that hopefully this will make enough people understand so that other couples won't have to explain.
But do you go through this whole thing? I mean, do you explain what you've explained to me, or do you brush them off, or do you...
No,
how,
we
how
explain.
do you explain it?
And we can never go into a new situation and not be without feeling, well, sometime this evening it may come up. And sometimes we handle it rather jovially, and sometimes it's quite a serious discussion. But the thing is, it is not fair to badger a child-free couple or to question them to the point where they become defensive, because after all, we don't do this to parents, and we should allow free choice. And why not react to non-parents the way we react to parents? After all, if someone were to be here on your show, Samantha, and to say, I'm going to have a baby, you would say, that's wonderful. Well, why can't we react to a couple who says, we're not going to have babies, by saying, that's wonderful?
Yes.
Why can't we do that?
You have non-Mother's Day and non-Father's Day, don't you? Isn't this rather defensive of you?
No, it's simply a gesture. It's meant to suggest how inequitable our society has been. There's always been a Mother's Day. There has not been a non-Mother's Day. So we'll suggest that there be one.
You make some interesting assertions in your book. Amongst them, you say there's a correlation between fatherhood and infidelity. Children are disruptive to a marriage. They precipitate divorce, and they can make a man feel trapped. I'm just wondering what you base all this on.
Well, interviews with all of the counselors mentioned in that chapter about husbands and children, there is no question, really, that men are more apt to be unfaithful to their wives after they have children. Arnold Silverman, in his similar book on the subject, points this out, that men are more apt to desert their wives, not just be unfaithful. There was a clinical study done in St. Louis that showed that about 1/3 of the men in this particular sample had first been unfaithful to their wife just after she had given birth to her child. Counselors will tell you that a peak period of divorce is the first year after the birth of the first child. There are reasons for this.
But you never
the
hear
main
divorce
reason,
lawyers listing children as being
No.
instrumental in
What
bringing
they
about a
list.
divorce. They list sex, they list
Money.
money problems,
Right.
but never children.
let's look at those. Sexual problems and economic problems. And depending on which statistics you use, one will be number 1 and one will be number 2. Children are costly economically and emotionally. But the economic cost of children can make a man feel trapped. Before he was a free person. One counselor put it this way: before he was a dashing racehorse with a pretty filly by his side. Now he is a workhorse pulling the family carriage in harness. A man, once he has children, feels reminders of unending financial responsibility descending like rain. It's not just the pediatrician's bills. It's not just the babysitters. It's not just later the orthodontist, the piano lessons, the summer camp, and the college savings plans. It's more than all of these. It's the knowledge that he is responsible for anything that this child will need, any problems that will arise, physical or mental or emotional, and he must therefore perhaps toe the line in his job, not speak up in his work as he used to, because now he can't risk losing his job if he has a fleeting thought that he would like to quit his job for a year. He can't afford to. If he would like to change careers, he can't afford the salary shift. This has been known to lead to problems, ulcers, excessive drinking, frustration, because it's not just a matter of an extra $167.50 every 2 week in bills. It's a matter of not being your own person, free to live your own dreams. You are a wage earner because you have a child that you are responsible for raising. This is oppressive, and it can take away from a man's sense of selfhood. And as far as sexual problems, as I explained in the book, a man who sees his wife suddenly in a maternal role can see this maternal role contrasting very sharply to her former sensual role of free romantic young girl. He can react as he did to his own mother and seek completion outside the home in terms of a girlfriend. So while the main causes of divorce are, yes, sexual problems, economic problems, the children often precipitate this, but not necessarily.
No, but don't you think that if a marriage is healthy and secure, children are not such monsters and ogres that they can really threaten it?
Arnold Silverman doesn't think so. He is the author of a book similar to The Baby Trap. It's called The Case Against Having Children. In fact, he said to me once that he felt a marriage that was extremely close would have the most to lose, because you add a child to that close relationship, and you're not just adding one relationship, you're adding 3 relationships. Before you had the couple. Now you have father-child, mother-child, couple-child. Add a second child and you add 9 relationships. And the contrast between the former closeness that was enjoyed and the way it must now be divided, the parents' personal resources divided, can be greater. I personally am not sure that I would agree that the best marriages have most to lose. In fact, I think the marriages in trouble have most to lose. I would be far more willing to see a good marriage take on the responsibility of a child than to see a marriage in trouble think, well, if we had a child, that would solve our problems, because that is categorically untrue, categorically dangerous thinking.
Yes. You've got an interesting chapter in your book on pregnancy, the psychological motivations, why women become pregnant. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, why do you think that women become pregnant?
Well, there are numerous reasons.
Yeah.
But
Why
I'm
do you
sure
think
that many people watching this program will feel that, well, we are equipped with a reproductive system. Therefore, you know, part of being a woman is using it. I mean, I'm not saying that this is my reason, etc.
Right.
You know, but this is one reason.
But women get pregnant, you know, at a particular time. We are technically equipped to have children, you know, in our mid-teens, but yet this is not the culturally accepted age for childbearing. Women get pregnant often because there comes a time when it's the culturally accepted thing to do. Now, there are other reasons I go into, of course, but I would say that we tend to live our lives in patterns that society expects. We will go to school, we will work perhaps, we will marry almost certainly. If we marry, there will come a time. It's almost like a time clock going off. Well, isn't it time you started thinking about a family? It's living up to social expectations rather than asking what's right for you as a person.
The logical conclusions of what you're talking about, you know, a world without children. Do you advocate this?
Oh, no, that's not the logical conclusion at all. What we're advocating, what the National Organization for Non-Parents is advocating, is that society no longer pressure couples to have children. And the pressure does not begin with the anxious in-laws questions. The pressure begins, I think, with a mother who's raising a child, because the mother is very apt to react selectively to her child's habits of play. If a little girl, for example, picks up a truck to play with, she may be disinterested. But if the little girl picks up a doll, she will play with the little girl and say, well, now, how are we going to take care of baby? We must do everything very carefully. Someday you'll be a mother, too. You see, she starts training the little girl for motherhood very early.
Did you have this? Did you play with
Oh,
dolls?
of course. But I do think there's a case to be made for a wider variety of playthings for both boys and girls. And there's a case to be made for saying to a little girl, someday, maybe you'll be a mommy, instead of someday you'll be a mommy. In other words, leave the option open.
What would be your advice to a couple who are seriously contemplating having children?
My advice would be wait, think it over. If you're perfectly convinced this year that you want a child, see if you're just as perfectly convinced a year from now. Because, you know, there's such a thing as a trial marriage, but there's no such thing as a trial child.
Ellen, thank you very much. Our guest tonight has been Ellen Peck. See you again next week. Good night.